60% mental and 40% physical.
Math was never our strong suit, but breaking down Ohio State football is. Sit back and join us for Buckeye Grove Instant Access, part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcast Network.
You can do it!
Brought to you by BuckeyeGrove.com. Post-game thoughts, immediate analysis, and much, much more to put the big game into perspective. Without any further delay of game, here's your host, Kevin Noon.
Kevin, goddammit.
Hey, welcome to the BIA podcast. I am your host, Kevin Noon, and it is game week. Never thought I was going to get here. I mean, I was skeptical until the point that we got to game week. We still have to get through this whole week before we get to Ohio State, Nebraska, 12 o'clock Eastern time on your local Fox affiliate. The big noon kickoff Saturday. Urban Meyer crew will be there for the pregame. Gus and Joel and Jenny will be on the call. You know, I can't wait to get into the Big Ten season. I've watched enough of the other leagues. It doesn't mean I will stop watching the other leagues, but I'm ready for some Big Ten football. And I want to thank you all for listening, and I'm going to bring in one of our great co-hosts. I'm going to bring in Jacob Binge, who is a intern extraordinaire for us, who's been doing a lot of good work. Before we went on the air, we were talking a little Major League Baseball, but we promise we'll try and keep that at a minimum here on the BIA podcast. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Hey, Kevin, it's great to be on the podcast. And yeah, you mentioned some baseball talk. You know, the World Series starts, but the biggest thing here is game week. And for me, it's been a long time coming. You know, 2 months seems like a short amount of time, but man, it really dragged its feet a bit. And I'm really thankful that it's here now.
Yeah, I think the uncertainty, and then even once they said they were coming back, and it's like, well, we'll see. And then, you know, you sit there and you watch the lists to see what's going on in terms of games being postponed, because the Big Ten certainly didn't leave itself any breathing room whatsoever, trying to do 8 games in 8 weeks. And we're seeing an average of a couple games a week getting postponed. So, you know, I think that this is one of those thresholds that we really needed to cross for things to feel real. And then I think tomorrow when we get to talk to Ryan Day, and then as we go on, and then it really won't be until we see that pregame show originating from Ohio Stadium on Saturday morning that will feel like it really is real.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, looking at some of the games in the SEC and the other conferences like that, they've had cancellations or postponements. And I think for them, they have a bit of an advantage with some bye weeks and are able to work around with some things. But like you said, the Big Ten's going for 8-8. And so if something pops up, I know Purdue and Jeff Brom, their situation's a little bit sticky. So we're going to see how the Big Ten's going to handle that should something a sort of an outbreak breaks out within the conference.
And, you know, we could go round and round about that whole situation, but you can't control what you can't control. So, you know, just, you know, hope for the best. And, you know, in this show, this Monday show, I promised last week we were going to start talking about the Big Ten and the Big Ten races in general. And I'm not going to start with the East. I mean, that's the division that everybody cares about. We'll talk about that one on Wednesday, but we're going to talk about the Big Ten West. And it's not that people don't care. I think that everybody's learned over this time to really, you know, look forward to every game, because it could be easily taken away from you. But now we're looking at the Big Ten West. I mean, if things go right, the winner of this division would face the winner of the East in Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship game. A lot of people, most people, almost all people are picking Ohio State to come out of the East. Seems to be some, I don't know. There's not a consensus when it comes to talking about the West. Before I get into any specifics, you know, just your overview, Jacob, on what you see, you know, coming out of the Big Ten West in this year. I mean, obviously, since we went from Leaders Legends to East versus West, the West has just kind of been there in terms of the Big Ten championship game. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been some great games and some really solid teams that have come out of that 7-team division.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think when we previewed the West a little bit ago, a few weeks back, things were quite different. We were wondering if, you know, Rondale Moore or Rashad Bateman were going to opt back in. We were approaching Wisconsin as if they were going to have Jack Cohn under center. And if Minnesota could, you know, follow up on their outbreak of a season last year, and things have changed. Players have opted back in. Purdue's got a couple of weapons back. And of course, Jack Cohn has a foot injury out in Wisconsin, and so his status for him being out indefinitely, Graham Mertz is likely going to take over as Badgers quarterback. That's going to throw things for a loop in Wisconsin. I think with that situation unfolding, I think Minnesota is going to have a lot of room to benefit from that. Just looking at some of the schedule, Wisconsin's going to open up with Illinois and Nebraska early on, and so Graham Mertz isn't going to have the toughest set of opponents to get adjusted out there in Madison. But Minnesota, they're going to open with Michigan in week 1, Maryland, and then Illinois. And so Tanner Morgan already being familiar with that offense, he can open out of the gate. He could have a lead and an advantage in that Big Ten West.
Yeah, and you touched upon a lot of the points that I'm going to get onto here in a second as well. And let's start with the Badgers. As you mentioned, Jack Cohn out indefinitely. We saw a depth chart come out for Wisconsin. I believe it was over the weekend. Graham Mertz is listed as your starter. When I went and I looked at the running backs, not names I'm familiar with now, but each year whenever Wisconsin has to break in a new running back, we're always kind of like, who? And then before you know it, they become a 2,000-yard rusher, and they go and do their thing. But I think that even though Wisconsin has the DNA of being a big offensive line team, a big running back team, the conversation that's going to be had most between now and the start of the season, and even once the season starts, depending on how things go, is the ascension of Graham Mertz into that starting quarterback position, just kind of out of duress because of the injury to Cohn.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think, as you mentioned, running backs are such a big, important position in the offense in Wisconsin. And with Jonathan Taylor's absence, they're also going to look for a guy to step up and carry the rock. And just looking at some depth chart projections here, I'm seeing Garrett Gorjek and Nakia Watson. Both of those guys had less than 331 yards rushing last season. But, with the lion's share opening up this season, somebody's going to emerge. And with some familiarity in there, they're likely going to have some success. But like you said, it's going to come down to Graham Mertz and whether or not he's going to look to pass and trust himself, or hand it off to somebody who has a little bit of experience running out of the backfield.
Right, and I'm pulling up the depth chart right now, and it is an or listed with Groshek and Watson. So you got a senior in Groshek, 5'11", 214, and Watson is a sophomore at 5'11", 228. To kind of stick with them, it's a veteran offensive line, which it always seems to be. It's just unbelievable how Wisconsin seems to always have a junior and senior led offensive line. And I understand you get a guy that moves on, you may have a junior behind them. It doesn't mean that these are all guys with 3 or 4 years starting experience. But a big line, nobody south of 305. You've got their center, Caden Lyles at 334, 6'3" junior. Their left guard is 328, 6'4". I mean, their right side, you're not really giving up much at 319 and 319. That definitely is a team that is defined by its offensive line.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of the Ohio State situation with Wyatt Davis, Josh Myers, and Thayer Munford. That protection up front is going to allow a guy like Mertz and whoever's going to be running at running back a little bit of time to figure things out, see what's unfolding in the secondary. And as you mentioned, Bruss back there for Wisconsin, Cole Van Lanen, those guys up front have some experience. They're going to be tough and they're going to be physical, just as the Big Ten West offensive line has been the past couple of years. And it's going to be beneficial for Wisconsin, just like you mentioned.
Then, I kind of question who I want to jump to next, since we're kind of working in the order of how the West could finish. I mean, could it be Minnesota? Minnesota is the only other ranked team in the top 25 coming out of the West right now, 21st to the Badgers 14th. They certainly have some weapons there. Getting Rashad Bateman back was huge. Your returning Big Ten wide receiver of the year. there's no lack of energy in terms of their coach PJ Fleck. I don't know. I of any team coming out of the West, I think that the Gophers are the ones that I have the least clear of a picture on. What's coming into focus for you?
Yeah, I think when you mentioned that energy with PJ Fleck, I think you hit it right on the head there. They're going to come out hungry, in my opinion. Just falling a little bit short of the Big Ten title game last season. Then they went out and beat Auburn in their bowl game. I think a lot of that energy is going to translate to 2020, especially with Rashad Bateman opting back into the season. They're going to have a lot of their pieces back for their puzzle. And I think that picture for me is going to be a little bit more clear than what you may have. But like I mentioned, they're going to have Michigan week 1. And so their first big test is going to come really early. And if they can put it all together, Bateman and then Tanner Morgan, and I think their running back situation this season is also going to be a little bit different with Rodney Smith, someone who rushed for over 1,000 yards in his absence. But I think they're going to feed off of that energy, and they're going to bring it back again in 2020.
I'm gonna skip over Nebraska for now. We can talk about them a little bit more at after the break. But let's talk Iowa Hawkeyes. They're another team that they've always been kind of one of these teams where when you expect them to be really good and you think that they're going to compete for a division crown, they end up coming in at like 4-8. And then when you're ready to write them off of being a 4-8 team, they surprise the world and end up being 9-3, 10-2. And I know we're not playing a 12-game regular season here, but I'm just speaking in most years. Iowa comes right out and travels to Purdue, who we will talk about next, and then we'll take our break. Breaking in a new quarterback certainly has been an off season of turmoil in terms of just some problems off the field in terms of, they got rid of their strength and conditioning coach. There have been a lot of issues going on in terms of accusations of, some injustices and things of that nature. I'm really trying to stick to sports where I can, but you have to wonder if these types of issues, and I don't want to dismiss them by calling them distractions, but when you're trying to get ready for a football season, it may be a distraction. It certainly is. It'll be interesting to see how this Hawkeye squad is able to focus on the task at hand.
Yeah, exactly. Ryan Day and the rest of the Buckeyes that we've talked to in the past few weeks, they've been hammering the fact that culture helps build a winning environment. And with Iowa, their situation's unfortunate, of course. They've got a little bit of uncertainty on the football side, whether who's going to be playing quarterback for them. But yeah, like you mentioned, culture is going to be a big thing. It's going to be a driving force week in and week out. Players are going to want to play up to their fullest strengths. But if they can get it together, they're a team that went 10-3 last year overall, 6-3 in the conference. So like you mentioned, they can be a surprising team when they want to be each week. And so if they can put it all together, figure some of their quarterback situations and stuff like that out, they can be that surprising team out there in the West.
Yeah, they're following 2 weeks after their trip to Purdue. They've got Northwestern and Michigan State, both games at home. So really after 3 weeks, then they're going to have to kind of figure things out, because then they go at Minnesota, at Penn State, home against Nebraska. And then they have the game at Illinois and then home against Wisconsin. But really, when you look at games 4 and 5 on that schedule, the Minnesota game is a divisional game. That's important. I think that the Penn State game is obviously very important, even if it is a crossover game. You've got 3 weeks to really kind of figure out who you are if you're the Iowa Hawkeyes.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And those middle games right there look to be on the road. So with 2 of the first 3 games for Iowa being at home, if they can figure themselves out, kind of correct some of these culture questions here. I think Kirk Ferentz, his situation at the top of the helm, his experience is really going to have to come into play, especially this season for him.
We're going to wrap up this first segment by talking about Purdue. As we'd mentioned, they're going to be playing Iowa there in week 1. some uncertainty going on in terms of the head coaching position right now due to a positive test, and doesn't necessarily look like we're going to see some sort of Nick Saban situation. Big Ten certainly has more restrictive rules in terms of not being able to test out of separation from your team. But they did get some good news back when Rondale Moore opted back in for them. It's a team that if you're an Ohio State fan, you're glad not to see on the schedule. And I think it's more of a matter of the name on the front of the jersey than the name on the back of the jersey, because every team has a team that just kind of is a thorn in their side. And Purdue certainly has been that thorn in the side. And when it looked like that there was a chance of when you were going to have an even further expanded Big Ten schedule, when what I call version 2.0 in Purdue, a game at Ross-Ade Stadium was on the schedule, that certainly was something that made a lot of people uneasy.
I can understand that. Back when we did the predicting Champions Week piece about a month ago, I had Purdue coming in at number 3, and that's an especially big jump, especially how they finished second to last in the West last season, went 3-6 in the conference. How could a team like Purdue jump to number 3? But like you said, that name on the front of the jersey, they can be that sort of spoiler role as Boilermakers if they can put it together. And they got some key pieces coming back this season in terms of Rondale Moore and quarterback Jack Plummer, who threw for over 1,600 yards last season. And so their schedule, looking at it here, just Iowa and Illinois opening it up. If they can put together a little bit of a role, they can be who they've been the past couple seasons. And as you mentioned, Ohio State's likely a little happy that they're not facing them this season, but I think the revenge and avenge mindset is something that Ohio State's going to miss.
It'll be interesting to see. We've got 3 more teams out of the West to talk about, and we'll talk about the week that was in college football here on the other side of this quick break.
Hague Water Conditioning has been treating well in city water in Central Ohio with American-made water filtration products for over 60 years. Have a water quality problem? The water treatment experts at Hague know how to solve it. Not sure if your water softener is working? They will test, inspect, and sanitize any brand of water softener for only $20. Schedule a system checkup or water test today by calling 614-836-2195 or visit them online at HagueH2O.com. That's HAGUE H2O.com.
Welcome back to the BIA podcast. I am your host, Kevin Noon. I am joined by Jacob Binge, and we are talking Big Ten West football as we are in game week for the Buckeyes. We've gone through 4 of the 7 teams. We will hit the other 3 now that we've been able to reset. And the Fighting Illini of Illinois, the Lovie Smith squad, they certainly were a surprise last year. I don't think they're going to sneak up on anybody this year. And then when you look at how their schedule starts out, they certainly could find themselves in a hole very early at Wisconsin, home against Purdue, home against Minnesota, right there in the first 3 weeks. There's no on-ramp there. There's no warming up. There's no directional ITT Tech on that schedule. They've got 3 big boy games to start off, but the Illini certainly were one of the better stories to talk about last year. They pulled off that upset against Wisconsin in Champaign. They get to start with Wisconsin, but this game instead is in Camp Randall. What do you see out of the Illini?
It was a good story last season, seeing the Illini upset Wisconsin and upset our apple carts when we wanted a top 10 matchup last season between Ohio State and Wisconsin. Lovie Smith has experience coaching across the board. He's going to bring that back this season. I think he's getting his quarterback in Brandon Peters this season, transferred from Michigan. And so it's great to have those guys return in those roles. But like you mentioned, starting off the season is going to be the key for the Illini because they're going to also have Ohio State later on and then Iowa following up when December opens up. If they can even stand around in those games early on, fight off some of those challenges, and then bring back that upset wild card, they're a team that could stick around the Big Ten West because they went 6-7 overall, 4-5, and in a matter of 1 or 2 games in the Big Ten West, you could see yourself vault up in the standings or vault down if you drop a couple of them.
Let's jump ahead to Northwestern, and we'll leave Nebraska for last, Ohio State's Week 1 opponent. Not a very good year for Northwestern. They're probably one of the teams that has like the biggest swings out there, and the swings up are kind of few and far between, but they're only a couple years removed from going to Indianapolis and taking on Ohio State. And since that game, it hasn't necessarily worked out for Pat Fitzgerald's squad. You look at the schedule, it's not one of the worst schedules in the world. I mean, I think coming out and playing a West Divisional schedule kind of has some built-in advantages and not having to play Ohio State and Penn State. Conversely, you're playing Wisconsin and Minnesota, but they start with Maryland, who is not highly thought of by a lot of people. And then they go to Iowa and then home against Nebraska. I mean, yeah, it would be great if they didn't have to go to Iowa there in week 2, but all things considered, and when we see some teams that really kind of got hosed by the Big Ten scheduling computer, Northwestern doesn't have one of the toughest draws, and most importantly has a very winnable non-divisional game to start the season as they kind of reboot and try and figure some things out and put 2019 in a rearview mirror.
Yeah, exactly right. That week 1 draw against Maryland, it's almost as equal of a draw as a crossover game as you can get. But as far as Northwestern goes, I'm interested to see what Patty Fisher can do. The linebacker out there who tied for the team lead in tackles with 88, also had 6 tackles for a loss. I'm interested to see what he can do on the defensive front because, like you mentioned, Northwestern being a team that's going to have some question marks, they're going to spend more time on defense, playing on the football field. But yeah, seeing their crossover games against Maryland and Michigan State, those aren't too bad of a draw considering the competition and the strength of the East. And Pat Fitzgerald, having to lead a team that went 3-9 overall last season, they're going to have some question marks to fill, and they're going to have to address it early on. And
they get a big transfer in with Peyton Ramsey, the former Indiana quarterback. They went the way of the transfer before and brought in Hunter Johnson, formerly of Clemson. That whole experiment didn't necessarily work out. So this Peyton Ramsey situation is a little bit different because Peyton Ramsey not only has a ton of experience, but he's also played in the Big Ten. He knows what he's going against. He knows personnel. It's a much different opportunity for him than Hunter Johnson, who just happened to run into a generational player named Trevor Lawrence and had to go find a new home because of that, who just really didn't have a ton of experience and got thrown into a situation where he wasn't necessarily surrounded by even Clemson's second and third team in terms of Northwestern. No offense, Cats fans, but he certainly, running the scout team at Clemson, probably had more stars around him than he had at Northwestern. But now you bring in somebody who's coming out of a kind of a similar program in terms of a middle of the Big Ten in terms of recruiting, maybe even a little below the midway point, and a program that's done a good job in developing guys.
Yeah, just going off that statement, Peyton Ramsey, a bit of fresh air out in Northwestern. He's coming off of 2 seasons in which he threw for more than 2,400 yards. That's going to be incredibly needed out there for Northwestern, considering that Clayton Thorson's absence the past 1 or 2 seasons. He's a guy who had great statistics and great numbers as far as the passing game goes. Bringing a bit of Tom Allen's offense into Northwestern may be something that's going to allow Peyton Ramsey to thrive a little bit in a new team, new university. And just like you mentioned, in Hunter Johnson's situation, he's a guy that was also surrounded by a winning culture. And so that quarterback room has a bit of a wild card with their intangibles. And so as we were talking about Maryland and Iowa to start for Northwestern, they're going to be a team that could pull out all the stops and be an upsetter early on if they can get the momentum going.
And then we finally talk about Nebraska. We talk about them last not because we think they're going to finish last in the West, but rather because they are Ohio State's first opponent. And you're going to get a ton of preview-type pieces this week over on BuckeyeGrove.com, so we're not going to go 20 minutes on talking about Cornhuskers at this point, but we will talk about them. Adrian Martinez, a year older, may not have some of the weapons around him that we're used to seeing, J.D. Spielman being one of them, but it's an offense that returns a lot of guys. But is that going to be enough? Is Dedrick Mills at running back going to be enough to be able to run on the Buckeyes? Is he going to be enough to navigate a difficult schedule through the course of the season? Is their line going to be able to hold up? I mean, there's just a lot of questions we can ask on the offensive side of the ball that we don't have the answers to. We can't pop in a spring game and watch that or go over practice reports because none of that was there. We can base things off of what we saw last season when it came to the Cornhuskers, what they were able to do, what they weren't able to do. Adrian Martinez threw for just shy of 2,000 yards, 10 touchdowns versus 9 picks, sacked 23 times. I'll tell you this, if he sacked 23 times over an 8-game regular season schedule, make it 9 when you throw in that crossover 9th week game, things won't be going well for the Huskers at that point if they can't protect Martinez.
Certainly, to say the least, for sure. But you mentioned a lot of guys returning on offense for the Cornhuskers. The biggest thing for Ohio State is that they're losing and they're missing a lot of guys on defense from last year's competition. And as you mentioned, Dedrick Mills is going to return at running back for Nebraska. And that defensive line for Ohio State has been one of the biggest question marks the past few weeks just from talking with some of the coaches. Especially the defensive tackle positions, the middle portion of that. Dedrick is going to have some fresh faces going up against in that line. And as far as Adrian Martinez is concerned, some of that secondary experienced a bit of a turnover for Ohio State. They're not going to be as familiar with Martinez, aside from maybe playing in the second half of last year's game, or subbing in for guys like Okudah and Jordan Fuller. So it shouldn't be, just looking at it on paper, Ohio State's going to outweigh Nebraska, but coming in and those intangible factors that we're talking about, the defense and the fresh faces for Ohio State certainly aren't as certain as they were last year in their competition in late September.
We've talked about Nebraska for a couple minutes, and we have not uttered the words Wan'Dale Robinson, and that's a flag on us because he certainly is the most explosive, exciting player on that team, in my opinion. No offense to Martinez, but Wan'Dale Robinson is very much in that same mold as Rondale Moore at Purdue. You look at his stats. I mean, he had 40 receptions, 453, a couple of touchdowns. He was also the third leading rusher on the team, 88 carries for 340 and 3 touchdowns there. They've had a lot of time to figure out new and exciting and unique ways to get the ball in Robinson's hands. And with Ohio State being a 23-point favorite in this game, they need to just kind of throw the kitchen sink at Ohio State, even if it is week 1, and just find ways to let athletes go out there and be athletes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And with this long layover and this delay to start the season, I wouldn't be surprised if Scott Frost pulls out some sort of wild play that utilizes Wan'Dale and Adrian Martinez kind of to get the new and fresh Ohio State defense a little bit thrown off here in the early goings. But I certainly don't envision Wan'Dale only catching one pass this go-around like he did last season against Ohio State, especially with all the hype surrounding him and his return to the Cornhuskers offense. I just think the biggest storyline for Nebraska is that their offense returns a lot of those faces from last year, whereas Ohio State's defense, they're going to see some new guys up front on the defensive line. The secondary is going to be different. It's not going to be as much of a walk in the park for Ohio State. They're going to see some new scenery on that front, whereas Nebraska is going to come in with a little bit of experience, but still the same challenge presents itself.
Well, it certainly will be interesting part of a full Big Ten slate next week, but let's put a wrap on this week and jump to college football in general, and we'll hit these pretty quick as we're closing in on the 30-minute mark. Obviously, the game that everybody wanted to watch, everybody wanted to see was Alabama-Georgia, 2 versus 3 at the time. Alabama 41, Georgia 24. Alabama scores 21 points in the second half. Georgia doesn't score a point. Obviously, Alabama was able to take care of business after a disastrous start to the game with an immediate turnover, but then they took it over like 2 plays later, took the ball back. Are we going to see these two teams meet again in Atlanta when it comes time for their conference championship game?
It certainly wouldn't be surprising, just given how Georgia is able to pull it out on their side of the conference. And Alabama really is just really putting on a roll. 21 points in the second half, unanswered. It was pretty mind-boggling how their defense was able to stop Georgia. Intercept Stetson Bennett for 3 interceptions, and Mac Jones certainly went off for something that could put him in the Heisman conversation with over 400 yards passing. A 4 touchdown to 1 interception. You can't forget about Harris in the backfield rushing for over 150 yards. They're really putting it together. And in a week with Nick Saban and his questions, whether he's going to be on the sidelines or not, they really came out, maybe not out of the gate, because at halftime it was a little bit of a different situation. But in the second half, the Crimson Tide really proved that they're a force this year after the turnover from the guys who left for the draft last season.
Yeah, I know I wouldn't want to be trying to tackle Najee Harris for the Crimson Tide. Moving ahead, let's talk Louisville, Notre Dame. Notre Dame wins a pretty unimpressive 12-7 contest over Louisville. Notre Dame does not really drop in the polls, but then again, neither did Georgia. So I'll save my diatribe about the polls for another day, another time. But were the Fighting Irish, did they just come out flat, or were they exposed for maybe not being this world beater that's like half a step away from Clemson and should give Clemson just this huge epic battle here coming up in November?
Yeah, just taking a look at some of that game, it was pretty surprising to see Ian Book only throw for 106 yards, not even throw a touchdown pass. But I guess the benefit to that, he didn't have an interception. But that Cardinal defense kind of, stifled Notre Dame to only 12 points. It almost looks like a bit of a non-football score, 12-7. But I guess looking at some of the team stats, the first downs were the biggest key factor. Notre Dame had 24 to Louisville's 14. They were able to convert 8 third downs. They were able to get it done, and the scoreboard doesn't really show that per se. Total yardage difference was about 100 yards. And the rushing was probably where the biggest difference was. Notre Dame just came out a little bit flat on the scoreboard sense, but, perhaps next week in their next game, they can do some more as far as finding the end zone, which was their biggest struggle against Louisville.
Your lone top 5 upset came at the hands of Florida State, 31, North Carolina 28, game in Tallahassee. Mac Brown still does not have an answer for Florida State. That was an exciting game to watch. It really seemed like UNC was going to find a way to come back down 3, just needing to even get into field goal range to try and get it to overtime. Really wasn't a question in my mind. If it got to overtime, UNC would have had all the momentum in the world and probably would have pulled it off as Florida State put up its 31 points in the first half and no points in the second half. But Carolina falls, and not really a top 5 team. So maybe the pollsters who were trying to bolster up the ACC schedule kind of got bit in the rear end on that one, because the Carolina for a large part of that game didn't look like a top 5 team to me.
Oh man, you got to wonder how Mac Brown feels after watching his quarterback throw for over 350 yards. He's got a 100-yard rusher and a 100-yard receiver, and he still can't get it done against an unranked team. Disappointing to say the least. I know I would be disappointed if I were at the helm of a team that put up numbers like that and you lose, by a field goal. For the Tar Heels, they came out flat in the first quarter and didn't score. They allowed a big second quarter going into halftime against the Seminoles. That's kind of where they fell flat. They just allowed a lot of momentum to go to the way of their opponent. Played a little bit of catch up in the second half, kind of like Alabama, scored 21 points in the second half, but it wasn't enough. And as far as the polls go, I'm going to need to see more from North Carolina, because 5 was a bit high for a team like the Tar Heels.
And then we'll wrap up with a pair of upsets in the SEC that broke long streaks. And I don't have the years in front of me, but South Carolina beats Auburn and Kentucky beats Tennessee. And of note really was that Kentucky over Tennessee game, 34-7. It wasn't even a game that was in question. It was 17-7 Kentucky at the half. Tennessee couldn't do anything. They've already relieved one of their assistant coaches of his coaching duties overnight last night. For the Vols being back, and that's if you listen to Vols fans, they sure didn't look it. And Kentucky sitting at 2-2, they're a breakaway here and a breakaway there from maybe being 4-0 this year, to be completely honest.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Just catching some of the highlights from that game. I saw the 3 interceptions, 2 from the starter, then 1 from the backup. But they still, fell a little bit flat against this Kentucky team, like you mentioned, that could a couple of turns this way and a couple of turns that way. They're a different team in the SEC. And it's something that's worth watching because, the Wildcats are known on the hardwood a little bit more than on the gridiron. But like you mentioned, things fall their way. They're a different team in the standings.
Well, we'll learn a lot about Kentucky here later in the season. I mean, next week they go to Missouri, and then they've got a 4-game stretch that has them home against Georgia, home against Vanderbilt, at Alabama, at Florida. So if they can navigate that 4-game stretch, anything better than 1-3, then they will be a tremendous story to talk about. And Mark Stoops certainly will have to be have his agent listening to a lot of phone calls from other programs who are looking for maybe an upgrade at head coach. But I want to just kind of throw it back to you for any other thoughts, whether it be on the week that was in college football, the Big Ten West, the Big Ten season in general, because we're going to be bringing on your compatriot Marcus Horton to be talking about the East on Wednesday. I want to give you the stage to be able to give your final thoughts on anything that you want to before we get to game week or before we get to the game.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really excited that it's game week now, and I think the biggest storyline for Ohio State is if this depth that Ryan Day keeps mentioning is going to show up. And if it's going to show up, it can't elude itself to being a negative strength in numbers, because with the wide receiver, the incoming freshmen being what they are, who's going to step up when they're given their time? Is Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson going to show up on the sidelines? Then I think really the biggest is who's going to carry the lion's share of footballs in the backfield, whether it's Master Teague or Trey Sermon. Personally, I feel a little bit more comfortable in Master Teague just because of his familiarity. But heading into Nebraska, they're going to have a bit of question marks to figure out whether they're going to go week 2, 3, and beyond with their guys on the offense. And as I mentioned earlier, the defense, the Buckeyes defense, fresh faces on that front. And so Nebraska brings a lot of guys back on their offense that saw the Buckeyes last season. It's going to be a bit of a different game as it was last season, Ohio State and Nebraska. And some challenges will come up, and I'm sure there will be some other things that weren't anticipated. But I think the biggest thing is that depth that Ohio State and Ryan Day have been talking about. And I'm just really glad that Big Ten football is back and that they're going to join the rest of the Power 5 leagues. And as the weeks go on, the Pac-12 also.
Couldn't have said it better myself, and I agree with you, and it'll be fun to talk about as we get closer. And you'll be on many more podcasts to come as we get into the season, and hopefully there are no interruptions along the way. But I want to thank Jacob for joining us here on the BIA podcast, and I want to thank you for listening to BIA podcast and being a loyal listener to this show. If you're not already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Helps us out, and we will talk to you here in a couple days on the BIA podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Noon, and thanks for being part of the family.
Be sure to stay up to date with Buckeye Grove Instant Access when the news breaks or after the big game, exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher as part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcast Network. Hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the know and never miss a single episode.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to click on that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing, and come visit us over at BuckeyeGrove.com for all the best Ohio State information on the web.